I do a lot of growing in raised beds. In fact, it's my preferred method in the vegetable garden. And after many years of growing in raised garden beds, I've encountered a lot of things that can go wrong. Things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do. Join me today as I share with you 10 of the most common raised bed gardening mistakes. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this is actually the second video where I'm sharing some of the things that can go wrong in the garden. So between the previous video and this one, I've actually identified 20 things that we often don't think about when we decide to grow in raised garden beds. And I'll link the first video at the end of this one. And as you might guess, the most common problems are placement of the beds, the material, the soil. That's what's in that first video. But this video focuses more on how we actually garden once we have the raised beds in place. Because raised bed gardening, I think, has many benefits. But if you don't do it quite right, you can actually add problems to your typical gardening activities. One of the benefits of raised beds is that they tend to have better drainage than many in-ground beds, especially if you have a soil high in clay content or live in a very wet region. Raised beds tend to drain better than the rest of the garden beds you might have. And that leads us to the first mistake, which is we often don't water enough when we're growing in raised beds. Because of the drainage and because these beds have air on all four sides, they tend to dry out faster. And so the plants in these beds are almost always searching for additional moisture. The inside of the bed tends to stay moister than the edges of the bed. So as you irrigate, as you water your plants, you need to keep that in mind. And most of us don't think about that. We water the entire bed the same, and then we wonder why some of the plants on the edges just don't do as well. The key is to make sure that each plant gets the water it needs. And in a raised bed, with that better drainage and with the drying, sometimes that means the outside of the bed needs more water than the inside of the bed. Another reason I like raised beds is that once the bed is constructed and you put the soil in it, you never need to walk on that soil. So raised beds tend to have fewer compaction issues than a lot of in-ground beds. But the issue we have is when we have an animal or family members that can walk across a low raised bed. And so this leads us to the next problem. The mistake is not realizing that soil compaction can happen in raised beds. I had a family member a number of years ago who was going to help me in the garden. Well, she doesn't do a lot of gardening, and I came out to find her sitting in the bed as she sowed seeds and just stepping backwards with each seed that she sowed. Well, the whole point is to stay outside the bed when you sow the seeds or work in that bed. So, raised beds are great for easing compaction, but don't get into the raised bed, sitting, standing, or allowing your animals to get in the bed. I really like the look of wooden raised garden beds, which is why I have them in many areas. But one of the issues with wood is that it breaks down over time. It can rot, it can crack. A typical wooden garden bed should last at least 6 to 7 years. And this is my oldest bed. It's almost 3 years old, and I can see that this lumber on the top half is beginning to show signs of age. I can probably get another 3 or 4 years easily. But if I took some effort, I can improve the longevity of these beds. And that leads to the next common mistake, which is not making efforts to preserve your wood. Just using linseed oil or any of the common wood preservers you can find at your home center will add years to your garden bed. Now, I've constructed these using different methods. It's a bit of a test. This bed is just a few months younger than this one, and the wood is doing fine. There's no treatment of any kind on this wood, which is why it's starting to show signs of age. I can fix this right away by just adding some of the preserver or linseed oil, but I want to see how long it goes without any treatment at all. The rest of the garden, I don't want to have to replace the beds. So I've taken those efforts so that my wooden raised beds last as long as possible. Because we're not walking on our raised beds, we're accessing from the edges, we can literally use every square inch of the surface to grow our plants. But we don't typically take the time to figure out how much of that space we have and how many plants we can grow. And that's the next mistake, is not adequately planning what we're going to grow in our raised beds. With all of this space that's usable, taking that little bit extra time during the off season to figure out the plants that we're going to use and how close together we can put them, it actually means you can grow more plants and really get the benefits of the raised beds. Do that planning. Take that time and use every square inch available. And for those of us who do plan and put as many plants as possible into the bed, the next mistake is not labeling all the plants we're growing. We tend to put our seeds in and assume that we're going to know what the plant is. But once everything starts growing and starts growing closely together, sometimes we get a little mixed up, especially when we're growing plants that look similar or have similar characteristics. So label the plants in the bed. And that may mean that you have a row of 20 or 25 labels. I've grown as many as 25 different varieties in a single raised bed. And without the labels, well, often I didn't know which variety of lettuce or which variety of radish or which type of beet I was growing until after I harvested. And even then, sometimes I wasn't sure. Label your plants. One of the reasons for growing in raised garden beds is to deter animal pests. The idea being that if the plants are raised up above the ground, those animals are less likely to eat the plant or eat the roots. But the mistake is that we don't put a barrier at the bottom of the bed to deter those animal pests that can burrow underneath. All of my beds have that barrier at the bottom. You can use hardware cloth or poultry netting. It depends on your pest. I have gophers in the area, so I have hardware cloth and the poultry wire to try to keep any burrowing gophers from getting into the beds. Even these low beds have that barrier at the bottom. Think about that. Just because the bed is higher doesn't mean they can't burrow underneath and just burrow all the way to the top. If you have those pests, anticipate that and put that in place before you fill your beds. You've probably noticed that I have a number of different types of raised beds in my garden. Even though I like the look of the wood, I don't use those wooden beds exclusively. And that's a common mistake that gardeners new to raised bed gardening often make, is thinking that a raised bed is only a rectangular wooden box. Well, it can be a number of things. You can have metal raised beds. You can have concrete block raised beds. You can have stone beds, brick beds, beds that have logs as the exterior. Don't get yourself into that mindset that those rectangular boxes are the only way to do raised bed gardening. Depending on your space, depending on your design, and depending what you like the look of, there are so many more options out there. So try more than one way of doing raised bed gardening. I talked about the idea of planning the plants you put into your beds to get as many plants as possible. Well, another common mistake is not using that idea throughout the entire growing season. One of the great things about raised beds is that they are so easy to put hoops and cover with plastic or any other type of material to extend the growing season. And so succession planting is ideally suited for raised bed gardening. The idea being that we're growing the plants in the first part of the season, and as we harvest those plants, or as those plants fail, we put in more plants for the second half of the season. Using succession planting and try to get not only as many plants as possible in a bed, but as many harvests with different plants over the course of the season is really a great way to use the raised bed gardening. In the beginning, I talked about raised beds being my preferred method in the vegetable garden. And that leads us to the next mistake many new gardeners make, is thinking that raised bed gardening is only for the vegetable garden. In this area of my garden, I have perennial plants, and this whole area is made up of raised beds. A raised bed doesn't need to be a high platform. It just needs to be higher than the ground. So these low beds right here have my asparagus, and those beds have currants, and these are my raspberries. All of these are raised beds. Granted, they're low raised beds, but I'm using the benefits of the raised beds in other areas, like this one, to include the perennial plants and the fruits that I'm growing. In my first video, where I talked about the common raised bed mistakes, I mentioned the spacing between the beds is important. You have to be able to walk through so you can access the plants that you're growing. Well, that leads us to the next common mistake, which is not anticipating how big the plants are going to grow in the raised beds. As we try to pack in as much as possible, we'll often grow plants that can grow quite tall, quite long. So if you're growing tomatoes without a trellis, or squash, or watermelon, or pumpkins, anything that will sprawl outside the confines of the raised bed, you're basically eliminating one of those big issues, which is space between the beds. Don't let your plants run wild. Anticipate how big those plants are going to grow, because you don't want a sprawling pumpkin plant blocking your pathway. As you choose your plants, choose wisely within the raised beds so that you don't undo some of the things that you did right in the first place. Every year I try new plants and new gardening methods in my raised beds. I'm always trying to find the best way of doing things. And as you can see, there's a lot of things that can go wrong if you don't anticipate or plan ahead of time. Do it right. Get everything set up and then use the proper methods, and you'll probably be convinced that raised bed gardening really is a good way to go. If you haven't seen that first video with those other 10 common mistakes, go ahead and check it out here. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.